Today we're going to dive into 101. So baseball ground mechanics 101. We're going to really get into the really simplest form of ground pressure for those that want to understand. We've done lots of work on showing some of the sexy sides of ground pressure with our coach, Chad Tyndall. We showed some swing mechanics, some swing phases. We got into some details there. And then with Mitch Taylor, we focused on a little bit on athlete first, but we're going to backtrack today and talk in the lines of something that we have to offer, which is a baseball 101 ground pressure, ground mechanics certification here at V1. But we're going to get into the weeds of it a little bit and just breaking down some of the simple terms, understanding what ground mechanics are. We're going to do a little slideshow. I was hoping to actually pull up some swings. We'll see if we can't get into that, but we're going to stay focused more on giving everybody that's joined us today a real basic understanding of why would I want to use ground pressure or ground force for baseball, for coaching. I mean, why do I need this? What's it used for? We use it in the clinical space. We use it in, medical space. It's very popular now in golf, but, why in baseball? I know that with a lot of S&C groups, they with baseball, with MLB, they brought in force plates and they were doing their basic testing of jump patterns, things like that. But, why is pressure more important? Why would I want to, utilize pressure? And we're going to talk about that. But to dive into that, I am going to share my screen. Can you guys see that?
All good over here.
All right, very good. I was just making sure. So we're going to start with a little slideshow representation. Prepare to be educated on why you would want to use V1, ground pressure, and why is ground mechanics important. And for those that are currently using it, a little bit of a review, but we're going to dive into some of the basics of ground mechanics for baseball and how to interpret, as well as how to utilize, ground pressure for baseball. So, here's just a little bit of a little sneak peek of some of the things and some of the features you get in the certification as far as, the different areas that we cover and why we call this a coach's smart tool. And it truly is. Whenever you're using a vision technology or you're using ground pressure technology, any of these types of technology, it's adding a smart device. It's basically empowering the coach, not replacing, not doing the work for, but empowering. And that's why we call it a coach's smart tool. And to have those tools as coaches, no matter if you're a trainer and the athlete side, the S&C, or you're on the, pitching coach, swing coach, hitter coach, fielding, catcher, you name it. Utilizing a vision tool is a smart tool, or utilizing a ground pressure tool is a smart tool. And we're used to smart tools. We have, phones are smart tools, so we can look things up, so we can have a Zoom call. So getting into, ground mechanics and key concepts, we're going to talk about weight versus pressure. We're going to talk about how to read ground pressure graphs for foot pressure graph, interpreting the technology, getting in a little bit into velocity and vertical force graphs. A lot of people typically struggle on those. What we have to understand, it's the same data. It's just presented in a different graph. And for those you that are golf listeners, maybe you haven't used those graphs yet. You haven't focused on that side of it. But we're looking at different things. We're going to talk about that and why all of those, correlate to each other. Here you're seeing a little bit of video of that smart tool being in action by a coach there. So what is ground mechanics, right? And most simply, ground mechanics is concerned with a description of motion or movement and how reactive ground forces create motion or movement. So what does that mean? So it's a study of our movement. So it's like biomechanics, okay? And so it's studying our movement, but with ground mechanics, as it correlates to the ground. So ground mechanics, science of explaining how and why the human body moves and the way it does because of its relationship with the ground. So if a person were to jump up in the air and actually just move, you'd see more of a kinematics, okay, except for the force that they actually lifted into the air. All right, so they're absent of force to be able to deliver a proper baseball swing, right? And so it's really important to understand that the one external force that we have to work with, okay, is basically, you know, gravity and then the force against the ground, which is a reactive force. So that ground reaction force, so how our body reacts into the ground, as you can see in that little picture up in the right side, as I apply a force into the ground, the ground applies a force directly back to me. All right, Newton's first, law, and third law. I'm sorry, Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as I apply pressure, it's going to apply pressure back to me. So if I'm using a ground pressure mat, I'm using a force plate, I'm using anything to capture information of vertical forces, it's showing me my amount of force into that ground, which is into the mat because the mat's capturing it. And then that force is going to be applied into my movement. So if I'm standing there and I lift my leg off the ground and I go to move my foot around, the force, and you see my foot move, right? So that force against my foot is me creating that force so that my foot moves. So you only see my foot move. You don't see anything else really move. But if my foot is grounded, if my foot is on the ground and I apply the same muscle reaction into my foot, what happens is you'll see my body move because the body is going to react. So you're hitting that large mass and it's reacting against it. And so that's what it's capturing. Okay, so that's what a pressure mat captures. It captures that information, that data, as I apply pressure to it. And why is that important? That's super important because it tells me where my body is in space, where pressure is created in space, where force is captured and recruited. It tells me basically how the rest of my body should move. And it's really important to note that's what's going on and that's what's being captured. Let's go even more basic. If you took this video right now, it's capturing me move around. It's capturing me, my audio, my voice. It's capturing my visual, me wearing a hat, me sitting here talking to you guys. The ground pressure mat is capturing the reactive forces. It's capturing my center of pressure, which is basically a correlation of center of gravity, how my mass moves, how my pressure moves. It's capturing how much, friction is being created in different directions. It's segmenting the amount of pressure in areas of my foot that are going to apply to different chain reactions the rest of my body. So depending on the technology, these all capture something different. What's incredible with V1 is we're capturing kinematic, which is the visual, right? Movement without force. And then we're also capturing kinetics, which is movement with applied force. And with that applied force, that's where we are basically getting into how the ground is applying a force back to me. Instead of getting into all the little deep details of this next slide, which is a lot of wordy stuff, really getting into some key concepts of ground mechanics, okay? So what you see there is a little baseball player, and you see forces that are applied as this animation goes through a baseball swing. What's going on there is the forces that are going into what the action is at a certain time is represented by thickness of the arrow, so the percentage of force that's being applied at a given time. And so there's really three very simple ground concepts that are used. And the key concepts is every move a player makes will be reflected in the ground experiences, just like we talked about. As I apply my body into the ground, into my force, it gives an equal response to the way my body moves. And then even small changes in ground mechanics can have a meaningful change in the way the player body moves. So the smallest movement of my hand with the bat and the way I move will have a really distinct change in the way everything is going on and what's being actually captured. And as we talked about before, is the ground reaction force, and the force of the ground is applying back through the feet. So to really understand,
Can we go back one slide real quick? I got a question.
Yep.
So super fascinating, the small changes concept, right? Like, can you touch on, when we're working with hitters or we're working with pitchers, trying to cue feels within certain segments of their foot, right? And certain segments of their foot, whether you're loading on the toe versus the heel, that has a chain reaction downstream to the rest of your body. Do you mind touching on, why is it important for, to use this technology to try to segment and really apply information towards that segment of the foot, versus just thinking, overall ground mechanics, foot to ground interaction per
No,
se?
for sure. No, for sure. Understanding that segmentation and that pressure is really super key and important. And it's really important to note where the pressure is and the amount of pressure that's being forced in the mat, okay, at a certain time. That's not forced in the mat, forced into the ground. And so is it forefoot? Is it rear foot? Is it lateral foot? Is it medial foot? Is it, I'm sorry, inside foot, outside foot, front of the foot, back of the foot, heel, toe? That's critical. Am I at my toes? Am I on my toes, through contact or launch? Am I not getting into my heel, excuse me, to apply enough reactional force? And it's really important to note that to create rotation, I'm not going to use the word torque, but to create the word rotation, which is deviation from torque, but you have to create friction in opposing directions. Okay. So if I am applying pressure from the toe to the heel in one foot and from the heel to the toe in the other, I am rotating my body. And we're going to talk about angular movement in a minute and angular trace. And if I'm applying from my toes on my back foot to my stride foot and we stay on our toes, you're going to see a linear pattern. And a linear pattern is not going to create a lot of rotation, at least not in the lower body. And where does our power come from? We all know our lower body. Mm-hmm. So if we see linear, that's more upper body rotations creating the swing. And that might be, good in an O2 count or something like that. And we can talk about and get into detail. And that's really up to the coaches and really having that understanding of when are these things applicable. What we're really trying to teach here is how to utilize the tool to empower the coach and to be able to read and see things that is only a feel or only something that's captured. And we're going to talk about in the negative move. There's pressure in that lead foot in a negative move going into load. Okay. You may not see it. You may not see that pressure shift. That's super critical. These are, really small changes like we're talking about that may not be captured. And because of the pace and speed of a baseball swing, it's very hard to be able to see that.
Right.
And it's really important to understand too, is it's not just a force in one direction that we're trying to capture in a baseball swing. All right. Or three directions. It's more important to understand that we're trying to capture the body movement of the baseball player, whether they're swinging a bat, throwing a ball. It's very hard to equate three simple numbers or 4 or 5, whatever it is. Okay. It's much easier to equate what is going on upstairs if we understand the segmentation of movement. And when we tie in, which we're going to talk about in a minute, center of pressure, that trace, where the pressure is in the foot at a specific time in the actual movement. And that hopefully answers your question and why you'd want to use ground mechanics and be able to quantify and objectively understand where a player is at a certain moment in time.
It's awesome. Perfect.
I saw a little misprint off put golf there, but we'll talk about that later. We do a lot of golf and baseball here at V1. Sometimes things get mixed up and when I'm typing this out for this presentation. So I do apologize for that. But for all those golf listeners, that was for you. So we have weight versus pressure. All right. So we can see weight shift, right? We can see the actual body shift around. We can see, the bat move in space, right? We can't gauge how fast that bat is moving, but we can see it move. And so we're watching mass shift around, right? And that's something that we can see. What we can't see is pressure. And pressure is force. How much force is applied? And when is that force applied at a given time? And that force shift is recorded through our center of pressure trace. And so the center of pressure is the average point of pressure that you're putting into the ground. So just like your center of gravity in your body, that center point of where that force is, working to keep your body upright against gravity. So it's really important to understand the difference that in kinematics we can see weight shift. In kinetics we see pressure shift or force shift. And we highlight that at the bottom there. We see the weight shift, we feel the pressure shift. All right. So the baseball player feels something going on. But how do you translate that? How do you coach that? How do you say, hey, that pressure needs to be in that front foot? You can't be leaned over that side. You can't get your hip out in front. You can't blah, 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 blah. Right. But we need to create force. And when you're coming through the swing, you got to get off the toe. You got to get into the heel on that stride side, to activate rotation before the hands come through. And, all the cueing in the world, is going to be very difficult if the actual athlete cannot get there. And it might be biomechanical restraint. And what I mean by that is there might be an issue with ankle flexibility. There might be an issue with stabilization in a dynamic movement, meaning if I go through a stride and get to that front side, I end up drifting. We all know what drifting is. I can't control my drift. I can't stop my drift once I start to generate force in that direction. How do I correct this? The way to really look into it and to dive into it is to start to gauge it and teach the actual player about the pressure. Where's that pressure? When you get to that side, here's the percentage that you got to that side. Now let's drive back through. Things like that are why this type of technology is so critical. And syncing, that vision with that ground pressure. And it's the force comes before the body moves. So if I'm going into my negative move, I'm creating a force on my lead side or my stride side or whatever we want to call that, right? Front side, all right? I'm going to force back into load. Now, I don't want to just unweight into load. I actually want to force back. I want to coil back a little bit. These types of things you may not see. You'll see that movement of the body, but you won't see if the pressure's happening where I'm driving back. That's so important because that force comes before motion, okay? You can't create motion without activation. And proper activation means that you contracted muscles in a certain way, you pushed against the ground, and your body is the result. The movement of your body is the result, all right? There's not a person in this world that can tell you or gauge that or give you data on that by just eyeballing it. All right. The days of eyeballing are not, in today's data-driven world, it's just not something that can be accepted. You can still coach this way, you can still use vision, but to really get into the science behind of what's going on, you have to understand that data output is really how we understand why the body moved and for what reason. And that's critical. All right. I don't want to just say, hey, the body moved because the body moved and you're a poor mover. That's great. Thanks, coach. I need data behind that. I need to understand it so I can correct it. There's got to be a call to action.
Phil, I've got a question. Sorry. Yep. I got a question from Coach Smith, Red Smith. So in other words, a heavier player with poor mechanics who hits a ton doesn't have reference for his true optimum output. So he thinks he crushed it versus the coach telling him you're swinging with 50% of your total potential pressure.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, well, we all see that, and, to be as nice as possibly that heavier kid when you're, let's say, youth baseball, 12U, okay? And that kid can crush the ball by just swinging his arms, all right? By the time that kid's 18, he's not crushing the ball anymore because, why? He's not catching up to it. He's not using his body correctly. He's not using his lower half correctly. That, that pitch that's coming in off speed or whatever it is, it makes it very difficult. It's something to teach how to use the lower half too, because, even some of the really good baseball players that we, examine with these tools, we still see, rotation not continued through, contact or impact. We see people stopping and then their hands, driving. There's a lot of different, mechanical issues that can be captured, not just with vision, because the vision only tells half the story. Mm-hmm. It can be captured with the pressure that tells the other half. Where was the load? How much pressure was in a certain part? Was he centered at contact? so he can actually deliver the greatest balance. Okay. So when we talk about center of pressure, we're talking about how well I stabilize myself or how much control I have over my movement. Let's remember that really quick. It's super important. When we're looking at force or we're looking at pressure, okay, and we can use those terms intermixed. When we're looking at that reading, we're looking at when we look at the COP, the center of pressure dot, which we're going to see, I think, on the next slide. That's our ability to center and stay in control of our movement. And for a hitter, control of movement instead of just momentum is going to create a player that can adapt and react to a pitch. Yeah, that strong kid can hit off a tee and he just blasts the ball in the cage. That's great. He can anticipate what's coming. Let's get him out on a real field, right? And now he has no idea what the next pitch is going to be, because that's the whole point of this. And that's adaptation, reaction, and understanding how to stay in control at different times or sequences in the actual swing and what to expect. And the only way to really teach that is to start teaching these types of pressure patterns, the way to get into the ground instead of sitting on top of the ground, where this person that's swinging with the upper body, because they're a larger player, they're playing on top of the ground. They're not using the ground to create the force that can actually deliver greater velocities, which end up creating greater bat speeds.
Phil, for creating better, greater velocities and bat speed, does the weight of the player, does that matter? How much force they're putting into the mat?
No, great question. So let's understand this. Your force is relative to you. All right. And so if you baseline it, it's your weight. All right. Now, granted, a big, strong guy, obviously, or girl, is going to definitely have a little bit of advantage. But let's take a very large individual that plays baseball, and let's take a smaller individual. Let's say Mookie Betts, right? Mookie Betts is not a large man, all right, but he has a lot of power. You know why? Have you ever watched him swing? He gets into the ground. He knows how to get into the ground. He knows how to leverage the ground. Three small things, and if anybody's ever heard me talk, they probably heard me say this line. There's three things at play in this world, and there's only three. It's you, a small mass. It's a large mass, which is the earth, okay? And it's one great force called gravity. And your ability to control your little mass, leverage that great big mass, and create some, reactional forces against gravity is what allows you to have power and ability to move correctly. So it doesn't matter how much you weigh, how big you are, if you know how to leverage those three things.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Coach. Appreciate it.
Let's jump into what I like to call ground pressure. And I hate to say the word, but ground pressure for dummies, and that's really where we want to go with this. We want to keep it as basic as possible. Here's why. It's not useful if you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you can't make it useful. And so this is really critical to the way we look at pressure or force. And no matter what technology you're using, it's all the same science, everybody. It's really a general science. It's how it's utilized. It's the interface that makes it powerful. And I want to just say right now, the V1, whether it's the PC or the mobile version, creates an interface that is the perfect complement for understanding this information. I spent a lot of time teaching, and I can teach this pretty much in 20 minutes. There's not another interface on this planet that I can teach in 20 minutes. So let's talk about reading ground pressure. Pressure is the sum of vertical force over a given area. All right. What is, so someone, okay, what's the difference, right? I know the question's going to come out. What's the difference between a force plate and a pressure mat? Well, we want to measure force over a given area. Do you know why? Because a baseball swing happens over a given area. It doesn't happen in a single line, in a single direction, right? So we want to be able to measure that over an area of space. I don't get a lot of information, and it still can be captured off of one directional force. All right. And one directional force is what typically comes out of a pressure map. Now it can be multiple. It can be horizontal force. It can be vertical force. It can be torque force. So there's 3 numbers, right? That doesn't tell me what the player's doing. Okay. That's like a radar gun. Done. I give you 1 number. What's really important here, and I'm segmenting here into this because I need to know what happened over an area and over a time that this actual person swung a baseball bat and hit a baseball bat, a ball, hopefully. So it's really important to understand what's happening over an area. So COP is the average point of vertical force a person is applying to the ground at a given time. So the COP, that dot, is my pressure, okay, in a single space at a single moment in time. So where my pressure is, am I weighted to the right side? Am I shifted to the left side? Where my body shifts is different than my pressure. All right. Because that's weight shift. That's my movement of my body. Now that can correlate to the actual, center of pressure as well, because of where I'm actually putting that force down. So my center of pressure is really, here's a key point. There's a direct correlation between control in a phase of a swing, a pitch, a throw, a squat, a lunge, a step, you name it. There's a direct correlation between your center of pressure and the way you're controlling your body. All right. That center of pressure will move way anterior if you start to get into your toes or start to lean forwards. Okay. You can shift that pressure back to stabilize yourself, and we can see that without your body moving that way. You can shift force into the ground to catch yourself. And we see those types of things happening. We see that in a lot of times in youth baseball and even up in the fundamental programs and stuff like that. So we see that center of pressure move around. Now, the center of pressure creates a trace. All right. And that trace is a line. And so imagine that little white dot left, little white dots over a period of time. And so as I'm moving, that little line is basically a bunch of little center of pressures as I move around. So it's giving me basically the trail of where I went. It's my footsteps of where I've come from. It's the trail of what I just did. All right. So it's giving me a history of what just happened and where my movement went, where my body went, where that pressure went. And that's super important to understand because through a sequence of a movement, we want precise actual movements happening to create the greatest force, to create the greatest control. As soon as we start seeing circular patterns and all these other different patterns, we're losing control. We do a simple test in balance studies in medical profession called a 4-stage balance. We do a best test. We do clinical tests of sensory interaction on balance. What we test there is what we call sway. So that little COP and that little line is sway. So that sway is deviations from control. All right. So if I'm standing still, I want to keep my COP as still as possible because I'm standing still. And as soon as I go to move, I want to control that movement. Poor control of movement means that line goes all over the place. Really good control means I went right to left. That would create a single line, right? Drawn right to left. Forward and back, single line, drawn forward and back. If I want to rotate, you're going to see an angular line because you're creating force as I'm creating friction in opposing directions with my lower half, my legs. I'm creating rotation. And so if you see angular lines, that's when rotation's happening. What it's capturing here is you see we have a little bit of a axis. We have a, COPX, which is the lateral. We have a COPY. And so heel to toe, and then we have left and right. Those numbers to each side here, the 98 and the 2, 98% pressure into the forefoot, 2% pressure into the heel there. Left side, if you're looking directly on this pressure graph, we're seeing 48 to the left side. We're seeing 52 to the right side. Very simple to understand. My trail foot or back foot, load foot, whatever you want to call that foot is, or backside is 52. my stride foot, lead foot, whatever you want to call that foot, is 48. And what is that? 48% of my total pressure, of my total force into the ground. Perfect static control and symmetry is 50-50. So if we're looking at a graph like this, it's pretty simple to understand what's going on. It's pretty simple to see that I'm able to control my body if that COP is in control. We see the heat map and the foot pressure. We see red. Obviously, red means that we have, let's say we're measuring in pounds per square inch, much greater pounds per square inch in that segment. We're seeing the yellow color a little bit less, the green, the blue into the white, right? So the amount of force that's applied, what we can imagine is, let's say, you know, that's a direct correlation to my total body weight, right? And we can imagine that if I weigh 100 pounds and I've got a red marker, it might mean that 25% of my pressure is in that lateral side of my ball of my foot. Super important segment to understand, especially as I'm trying to create, you know, rotation in my baseball swing. So super important information here is captured, and it's really important to understand that looking at this graph tells me a story of what's going on upstairs. And I think that's, you know, super important to understand. Anthony, did we lose you? You're muted there.
I'm back. We're
There
here.
you go. Before I move on from the ground pressure graph and understand this reading, I just wanted to see if there was anything I need, or you had any questions or anything like that before I move into the next segment. And I'm going to capture a little bit more of this graph just so everybody can understand it. And I hope I'm not losing people a little bit as I'm drifting into a little bit more explanation of this. But we good to move to the next one?
I think we're good. Thanks.
Yep. So
all right, hold on. We have a question from Dennis. Will we have good or bad examples of this graph? So, you know, probably specifically as to traces or heat map segmentations on the foot, I'm assuming.
Meaning, as far as movement goes, or what's being captured, good and bad? Is there a bad and good? You know, I never like to say good or bad.
Yeah.
I like to say characteristics of movement.
It's a good question, Dennis. Yeah. Do you mind maybe expand a little bit more on that? Maybe, you know, are you talking about whether a player can get into his lower half efficiently or not? Maybe we can try to find some examples as to some of the things you're looking for. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got to understand that obviously the good and bad is the measure of control.
Mm-hmm.
If you saw that little COP go all over the place, I have lost control of motion, obviously, right? And no matter what nickname you give it, it's lost control of motion. Now, if I create a very distinct pattern or distinct direction from point A to point B, and whether it's linear or angular, I've stayed in control of my body movement. Now, deviations outside of that direct line of control means that I've lost balance. I've lost control of what I'm trying to do. And when I do that, you lose the ability of force, you lose the ability of velocity, you lose a lot of these different types of things that we're trying to hold on to or attain or capture during a swing. And so very simply, if you want to rate a bad or good, I'm not sure there's a bad or good, but you'll see very quickly the characteristics of each of your players as you start to measure them. And you will start to identify characteristics that tell you, oh, now I see what's going on. Didn't realize it. The cue I was using wasn't working. What I want to focus on is changing that pattern to create greater control. Here's some drills, here's some exercise, here's some different things that can create a more positive, you know, pattern that will create the result I'm looking for. Remember, here's one thing, and we really didn't touch on it yet. There's two parts of analyzation. And so there's two parts. There's the mechanical side, which is, the swing, the body movement, capturing information on force, capturing information on vision, blah, 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 right? Then there's the result side. The result side is being captured by a radar gun. The result side is being captured by a launch monitor. There's two sides to this. Those results, though, are a direct correlation of the mechanics. And what we do in coaching is we teach the mechanics. The other results is game. What happens in a game is the result, right? So the V1 tool, SMART tool, is a way to empower the mechanical side so that we can deliver better results and capture those results. So I just want to kind of like add that in really quick.
Right. Like the performance aspect, the results is the what, right? And then, the ground mechanics and ground pressure is the how. How are you getting those positions to optimize and, get those results that you're looking for, right, as a coach? And I think that's kind of the difference, right? We've got technology that are very result based, and then we have technology that allows us to really paint a picture as to what is the player actually doing, right? Super important.
No, that's great. So I wanted to capture this really quickly. If anybody tuned in a few weeks ago, we did a athlete first. We did a functional movement screen, and we took a player and we analyzed their movement patterns. And I'll tell you right now, you wouldn't know if that was on the right side there, the lunge. You wouldn't know if that was a baseball swing or or a lunge if you didn't see the visual. Now, obviously, the foot pattern is a little bit different. It's captured that way, but that backside, that's a toe that could be, through a swinging pattern, and how much pressure is in that toe. And what's really neat is, and why, and why S&C is so important, why movement capture is so important. I can identify, or you can use this tool to identify a player's movement pattern and movement abilities, their ceiling of movement abilities, by running through a screening like this. And you can screen the individual on what their tendencies are. Do they have a tendency to get into the toes? And you can do a squat test to find that out. And you can capture that information even if you can't see it. You can see a shift into one side of their body to help stabilize it once they go into a stride. Baseball is a lot of single leg balance, unlike golf where it's two leg balance, right? It's bilateral. Baseball is single leg and stabilization to create force in a horizontal space. And it's really important to understand that the way I move and the way it's captured is critical to my sport specific movement. And I wanted to throw this in there because we've got to understand, what we're capturing here with ground pressure and what we're capturing with ground mechanics is movement. It's movement, and it doesn't matter what the movement is. What we're focused in our concentration here, and today we're talking more about the baseball swing than say a throwing motion or pitching. It's capturing movement. And it's capturing movement you can't see. And remember that first thing I said, that force comes before movement. And so what we're seeing here is a capture of that force that's created that movement, whether it's what we're looking for or what is more precise at that time, or what that pattern is for that individual. And really what we're trying to see is what we call coordination, the coordination of these things happening at a certain moment in time. Are we creating enough force in a certain against the ground so that your body reacts the way we want it to react, and we can capture that amount of force to create the velocity and power and accuracy to hit that baseball. And so just want everybody to kind of have an understanding that what we're doing here, it's applied to every movement pattern. Even just standing still. You'll learn a lot about, setup just from, standing still. So getting back to that pressure percentage graph, the foot map is how much force is within each part of the foot and where the highest force applies. And so you're seeing that as a heat map, red, blue, green. these types of hotter colors are going to be your stronger values. And so if we put little numbers there, and that's what it's actually displaying. It's, behind the scenes, it's measuring, pounds per square inch or in any, measurement value we want to. And it's displaying them in a color heat map. So you understand how much force was applied or how much pressure was applied at a given moment in time that created that reaction and ended up in that result. And then, we have a, forefoot and a rear foot, measured on the actual mat. And so we're looking at along that axis, and we're seeing also the right and left. And so all those things are being captured basically on what that baseball player is actually doing and what's going on during that swing and where that pressure is being applied to create force. Someone that's staying back, on the backside, you're going to see that trace is not going to travel to that front side. You're going to see someone who drifts, who's going to drift very quickly to the front side, probably too early, and then end up having to use their hands, predominantly to actually swing. So you'll see different patterns happening. And let me tell you, for youth players, this is an incredible tool to help teach them because they're such visual learners. Excuse me. We've spent a lot of time on this. Anthony, did you have something?
Yeah. So let's talk about that communication or that bridge of information to the player, right? Through your experiences, Phil, like how do players catch on to this pretty quickly? How do you, when educating or walking them through information, right? Obviously, it's with you, the coach. You're not sending them a report to go look at and come back with questions. It's, hey, you're going to take a swing. You're going to look at this. You look at the graph, look at the video. How has there been any challenges with that communication with players? Do they catch on pretty quickly? I know there's a lot of coaches on here that may be interested in implementing this technology. How does that interaction work for you, at least?
No, for sure. And so I spend a lot of times more at the youth level. I do a lot of education with the higher levels, but pretty much all ages. And when I say that, I mean even 8U. Understanding the mechanics and seeing the patterns and understanding what's trying to be accomplished. And when you're working with a younger athlete, how much they like video games, being able to see some type of graphic that helps them understand what their body's doing or what you want their body to do. Cues can get frustrating. And if you've worked with youth athletes, and I've been working with youth athletes in all different ways and patients and you name it for my gosh, almost 30 years. Cueing a younger player is going to be harder, and they're going to start to tune you out when they can't accomplish what you want them to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And having them, and in the end of the day, you're not there when they're up at the plate. All right. If it depends on the type of coach you are, you may be yelling at them while they're standing in the box, but that's probably not a good idea. At the end of the day, they got to know how to create a result. This helps them understand their body. All right. And I don't care how old you are, because I work with all ages, even into seniors with this type of stuff. And to start to identify that's how my body works. I had no idea I put all my pressure there. I had no idea that I'm so dominant on my left side when I do that. I had no idea, blah, blah, right? When you're working with an athlete, this is such a great tool to create communication of understanding of what you want them to do or accomplish. You guys can share in that understanding. And that's what I've seen and I've communicated and I've heard from all the coaches that use this type of technology. It really helps bridge that gap in understanding of what, is trying to be accomplished with the coaching.
And just
I think we lost Anthony. All right. I'm going to move to the next segment until he comes back. Now, we talked about interpreting different traces, and we talked about in that pressure graph, and I know we're going to be wrapping up here in a second, and I'll let Anthony come back on. But just really understanding this and understanding the importance of knowing that there's two distinct movement patterns that are most controlled movement patterns. And that's a what we call linear or angular trace. And so a direct line of motion. So going from point A to point B without deviations or displacement of your actual movement pattern. And if I'm creating more of a linear pattern, it could mean that I'm swinging the bat directly off my toes. You can see in that first picture at this batter, and the pressure mat is actually set up backwards. So that's the COP's in his lead foot, his stride foot right now. And his pattern, now there's a lot of scribble scrabble there, but that was pre-swing. Now his pattern went directly from about mid-foot to forefoot to mid-foot to forefoot on the front side. That means his lower half never truly rotated till this last, moment in time where you could see his hip come around, but a very upper body swing. And so the rotation was created through the shoulder girdle instead of the pelvis. And he applied that force, and that pretty much a contact swing, making sure that I'm eliminating extra movement so I can control my force. It's a lot easier controlling force side to side than side to side and back to front at the same time. And side to side and back to front at the same time is what creates rotation. And that's how we measure that rotation. And that's what you'll see in an angular trace. You'll see basically someone going from their heel to toe to heel. And that is a circular pattern. And that pattern creates greatest rotation, and greatest rotation creates the greatest amount of force that can be applied. And what you're seeing in that right picture, the bottom one from there, is more of an angular pattern. You're seeing angular pattern and a direct angular pattern pretty much of a baseball swing. And that's going to deliver a lot more force. Now, we talked earlier about someone that's larger. You can create that much force if you're just a larger individual with a larger upper body. But I'll tell you right now, I mean, you're probably not going to do much with the baseball, especially as it, moves or creates angles. So it's really important to understand that if you see a pattern outside of one of these lines, either going side to side or up or down, or you're seeing an angular one that's going, on an angle, those are patterns that we're looking for. Patterns we're not looking for is deviations and circles and squiggly lines and all those types of things. That means you lost control during that segment in time. And so I'm waiting for Anthony to come back online here, and probably going to wrap up in a second here. But really just wanted to get into some of the kind of 101 on interpreting technology, so people can have a better understanding of, if I currently use pressure mat, what am I really seeing, and how can I use this for more effective tool for my coaching, or if I'm a player, to understand it. What we didn't get into today was velocity and vertical force, and how to measure those and how to see those. But really today was more about understanding just that first graph, that very basic graph. All this information is going on though. I mean, it's recording velocity of movement. It's recording basically the force that's going on at the time. But this first graph really tells the story of what's going on upstairs. Hey, Anthony, welcome back.
Hey, I'm here. No, great stuff, Phil. I appreciate you walking through, what we would consider our ground mechanics 101, right? And, we thought as a need to pull it back and really just kind of teach the science and teach what we're actually capturing, right? So I appreciate you popping on here and walking us through. And thank you to all the attendees here, asking questions and working through this with us. You can view most of our YouTube webinars that Phil has hosted on our YouTube channel. We'll have the team post that in there. But again, thanks a lot for tuning in. If you're interested in our baseball and softball products, you can reach us at sales@v1sports.com, and we'll put that in the chat as well. Or if you want to talk to Phil or I directly, you can always reach us at our email. So thanks again, and looking forward to talking to you guys soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks.